to use water painters on my projects to get a really beautiful watercolor look really simply when I'm coloring in images. Today I want to show you how to use water painters in a new way to get a new look on your projects. The technique I'll be sharing today is how to do lineless coloring, as you can see right here with this apple image. Now normally when you use water painters, you're going to stamp with a color that is not going to bleed. A lot of times this is black with stays on ink so that your water doesn't bleed, but it definitely gives a different look when you have those edges that show up so dark. So what I want to show is how to create something like this and get a much different look with your projects. The stamp set I'm using today is Apple Harvest. I think this is a really neat new set, and I have been looking for a project to make with it, and I thought this was perfect for it. So what is different about this is how you stamp that image. Now, obviously, we have to do something so that we can see it on our project and be able to color it in. We can't just freehand it by looking at this. Some of you, I'm sure, could. I cannot. I do not have that talent. So we do need to stamp it, but we need to stamp it really lightly. So when you're choosing the color to stamp with, you either want to choose a light neutral color like a crumb cake or a Sahara sand, gray granite, something like that, or a color that's going to blend in really well with what you're coloring. I decided for this one, since I'm using a lot of red, to actually use petal pink. So this is a light pink, and when you're doing this yourself, I'll show you how I decided how I was going to stamp this. So I stamped several times onto some scrap paper. I actually stamped 3 times, and I wanted to decide how many times am I going to stamp off onto scrap paper before I stamp onto my project. And I decided that 3 times was a little, it's a little light, but I was still able to see it. So I decided for this color to stamp off 2 times, and then stamp my 3rd time on my project. Okay, so I can see that. I can see that enough to be able to color it in. If it's easier for you just to stamp off 1 time and then stamp on your project, you can try that. Or if you have a light enough color of ink, you could just stamp directly on here without stamping off first. Now we're going to color this in just as we would normally with the water painters. Or you can try this with other coloring techniques as well by stamping light the first time. But I'm going to use my water painters here and bring in my blocks that have some of my colors on them. What I like to do when I'm coloring with my water painters, I use a block that doesn't have a stamp on it, ink it directly onto my ink pad, and then this is my little palette to pick up the colors that I want. And what I do, so I have the water in my brush here. I squeeze a little bit so that I have some water on that block, and then I can use that water and mix it around some. So I usually blend a little bit so I have some real light green, and then I leave some that I have not blended with water. If I want some darker colors, I can pull those in. So we will go ahead and start with the leaves here. And I always like to start light. You can always add in darker colors if you want it darker, but if you make it too dark at first, you cannot really pull that color back off. So we'll start really light here. And you just want to stay inside those lines. I will mention the paper that I chose because you can use regular white cardstock if you want to. I would suggest using either shimmery white cardstock or watercolor paper if you have them available. And the reason is water or the color really flows around better. Now, once we get done, we can take a look. I did my first sample on watercolor paper, and this one is on the shimmery white. So we can take a look at the differences. So I got the real light green in, and now I'm going to go over where the shadow lines or the leaf veins were with the darker and add that in. Now, if you want to add color in and you don't want it to bleed outwards, as I did this, it bled outwards a little bit because it's still wet. If you don't want that, you want to wait until it's dry and then go back in and add those darker areas. Add a little bit darker around the edges to look like a little shadow where the leaves kind of dip down at the edges a lot of times. And now I am ready to move on to my next color. So I'll clean my brush off on my scrap paper here, and let's move on. This is soft suede. The colors I'm using are Old Olive, soft suede, and real red. So I'll do the stem with my soft suede. I want to get it a little bit darker here. And now we can do the apple. So again, with the apple, I'm going to start pretty light, and I can always go back in and add more color if I want to. So I'll color this in all over. Before I go back in and do some shading. So the color and the water are really gliding nicely over this paper because I'm using that shimmery white. If you use regular white cardstock and test it out against the shimmery, you will definitely notice a difference in how that color and the water move and flow. I will mention this, a benefit of doing this is if you go outside the lines, it doesn't really matter because nobody knows where the lines are once you cover them up with your colors. I went outside a little bit on my first sample that I did, and it just doesn't even matter. Nobody can even tell. So that's one of the reasons I love to use my water painters in general, is because it's just such a carefree way of coloring. I feel like if I go outside the lines, it just doesn't really matter because it looks like watercolor, and watercolor is carefree and you don't have to stay inside the lines. So that is a benefit of doing this. You just don't really have to worry about those lines too much. If you go outside, no one even knows where they were. So as I'm doing this with the shimmery white cardstock, I am noticing that it is a little bit harder to get my colors to blend than it was on the watercolor paper. So I may end up with some of these lines that I can't really cover up. We'll see how this goes as I keep coloring. But if you really want your colors to move and flow, and if you get darker areas like that, to be able to lighten them back up, the watercolor paper is going to allow you to do that better than the shimmery white. But I am going to be able to blend this pretty well here. We'll do a little bit more. I think I'll add a little bit of a shadow around the leaf to make it look a little bit darker there. And then I think we will be done with this. So I add a little bit darker. You do want to be careful around those areas where your colors come together because the colors do like to flow some. If you don't want your colors to flow together, you want to be careful and not apply too much water. Okay, so I am going to call that done. I could play around with this all day long, I'm sure, if I wanted to, but I really love the way this looks. I think this is such a neat technique. Now I'm going to bring in, I already prepared the card base for this. We'll go ahead and finish this and turn this into a really simple card. But before I forget, let's look at these up close so that you can see how they look. The one on the left I did with the watercolor paper. The one on the right I did with the shimmery white. So this one turned out a little bit lighter. I could go back over and make it darker if I wanted to. But this one, the water and the colors do like to flow a little bit easier. So if you want really smooth edges, you may want to stick with the shimmery white because with this one, they do bleed outwards just a little bit more. So I prepared this background. I stamped this image all over the background. Just took a few seconds, and I am just going to pop this up on top for a really simple card. So thanks so much for watching along today. If you are interested in any of these products, you can find links in the video description below. I hope you have a blessed day, and I hope you'll be back again next time when I'll be here helping you to hand make with love.